All right, another chart. You know how I love my charts here on the Jackson Kruger Sports YouTube channel. This is by a great Twitter account, Ben Baldwin. He's the same guy who makes the, if you've been watching this channel for a while, you know how much I love the fourth down decision bot. That guy does a lot of analytical stuff, and this is a good chart he made that I find fascinating, so I wanted to talk about it with you guys and see what we can learn from it. So here's the chart. So right here, basically what we're doing is, just by looking at this, is looking at which positions tend to perform better in which rounds they're drafted, or even where they're drafted, because it's not necessarily round by round. It can also be pick by pick. I'm not going to get into too much detail about each one of these, but just kind of real quick talking about, how this chart works before I'll just get into my findings in a second. Like the top left, the quarterback section, basically what you're looking at is there's 4 different sections of grading if the quarterback, the elite tier, the second tier or better, the average tier or better, and then the low tier or better, and kind of saying what are the chances of your player being X good given where they're drafted. So for quarterbacks, if you were drafted first overall, you have roughly a 30 to 40% chance of being elite. Meanwhile, if you were drafted in the first round or first pick of the second round, it drops to about 12.5%. And then by each tier, you can go from there. If you want to pause this and look at any specific position, you can. But what I'm going to do is just go over to kind of what I found and really talk about where I think you should draft each position. So right here, first I'm talking about the elite guys. So where would you want to draft someone if you're trying to get an elite player at that said position? When should you go about doing it? Of course, it's always going to be the highest in the first round. That's going to be the best odds. But basically what I'm doing is saying, okay, in which positions do you still have decent odds in the second or third rounds? There's none that you have decent odds past the third round, but there's some that you have at least decent odds even in the second or third round. So first, the ones where you pretty much have to spend the first round pick on a guy if you want them to have, above like say an 80% chance of being elite. You have quarterbacks, edge rusher, defensive interior lineman, and then centers. So those are the 4 positions that, you want an elite quarterback. Everyone wants an elite quarterback, probably going to have to spend a first rounder on them. Same thing with edge rushers, defensive linemen, and centers. This could mean a couple of things. This could mean that teams just draft these positions more and care about these positions more, which means more go in the first round. It could also mean that teams are better at evaluating these kind of positions. Meanwhile, the next tier, these are the guys that you can draft in the first or second round, and they have a pretty decent chance of being elite, at least somewhat significant odds. Because again, no one has a great chance of being elite, no matter how good the position is. But regardless, wide receivers, someone you can get in the first or second, tackles first or second, corners, safeties, and then guards. So centers, you pretty much have to draft in the first round. And again, I know people are going to bring up exceptions. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule. These are just trends, and also, of course, you should pay attention to the scouting department. Use every player, don't just look at this and say, oh, well, if it's a center in the second round, probably won't work out. Well, if you like him, draft him then. But again, these are just the trends. Finally, linebackers, tight ends, and halfbacks. You can get elite guys even in the second or third rounds, along with the first round, of course, which the way I view it kind of does check out. I mean, just from looking at this, all this stuff logically makes sense to me. I do feel like we've seen a decent number of later round linebackers, tight ends, or halfbacks turn into really good players comparative to the rest of the league, or rest of the positions. I do feel like for the most part, it's kind of rare for second and third round picks at any of those top 4 positions to really thrive. Again, exceptions, of course, but just as the trends go. So this does check out to me a little bit, and I find it fascinating. And what it could tell you maybe is that, hey, it might be a good idea too if you are a team that needs a center and also a linebacker, for example, just throwing that out there, maybe draft the center in the first round and then draft the linebacker in the second round. Now let's go over to average. That's all we're looking for, is what Ben Baldwin attributed to be either average or better. So it doesn't mean that you're only going to be average. And what we're looking at here is really just what rounds does it kind of drop off at? What rounds after that round it's going to be more difficult to get that type of player. So at the top, there's 2 positions that really in rounds 2, you can still get at least a solid starter. But after that, it just becomes a lot more difficult, and we do see a drop-off. Again, and there's gradual drop-offs throughout, but there's the biggest drop-off after that second round for tackles and centers, which to me is very interesting because if you remember, a position like tackle, it was kind of the elite tier was the first and second. So it really has a big drop off. So for a tackle, getting one in the first or second round is good, but if you need a tackle, you want to make sure you get one in that first or second round. And so kind of second round tackle feels like that's probably the move to make, because they can still be pretty successful, but after that, chances are they're not going to be very successful. So that's kind of the way you want to view this. Again, you go all the way to the bottom, it follows kind of logically, right? Again, halfbacks, linebackers, and tight ends, just like we saw with the elite guys, it's, literally these three are also further down, where halfbacks, linebackers, and tight ends are all positions that you can get later in the draft. In fact, you have a pretty decent chance of getting a solid tight end in the 5th round if you draft him. So that's the move, is if you need a tight end, don't spend a first-round pick on him unless it's like a Kyle Pitts guy who you feel can be super elite. If it's not that case, you're probably better off just waiting, and if you just need a solid starter, get one later on. Same thing with linebackers and same thing with halfbacks. Of course, that chunk in the middle, that's, I think, still notable. We're kind of in the 3rd round, so really day 1 and 2, those are the main kind of rounds that you can get solid players and have a decent chance at getting those solid players. And that might be another good way to kind of view this if you're an NFL team, is you say, hey, round 1, we have a good chance at getting elite guys, specifically at the most important positions, so quarterback, and then a lot of teams view edge rushers as the second most important position, so those two things. Day 2, that's where we can get guys who can just play, guys who can start for us and be solid contributors. And then day 3, so rounds 4 through 7, that's when you want to get halfbacks, linebackers, or tight ends early on. And if you don't need any of those positions, that's when you want to simply take flyers on guys. Maybe go for higher upside, because the chances of them becoming solid starters anyways are very low, so you might as well take a chance. So that's what this data tells me. And listen, it's hard to really give an in conclusion to some degree of this is what teams should do, because there's just different teams, and where you're at kind of changes what you should do, right? But like, for example, the Packers, I think, is a good example of using this to your advantage of, listen, your team like Green Bay, who you really need wide receivers, don't need a ton else. You're pretty good across the board. It's wide receivers that you need. Maybe there's a couple other positions that you could go after. I think it'd be really tempting for them with multiple first-round picks to say we got to get a wide receiver with at least one of these picks, maybe even both of those picks. But you don't have to. You have still pretty good odds of hitting on a good player in the second or even 3rd round. And if you're just looking for guys to be good now, then maybe that's what you want to do, is go after that. Whereas for, some other situations, it might be something different. Again, it's all situational based on where you're at as a team, and I think that's what makes this stuff so fascinating. It's not something that should definitely make you change your opinion on a player. For example, if you like a halfback who's getting projected to go into 6th round, there's still a chance he's going to be successful. If you like a quarterback who's projected to go into 5th round, if you've done your research on him and you still like him, even though everyone else says, not a first-round talent, still might be worth taking a late flyer on, or even taking a second-round pick on, if you think that they're going to be better and you think they're getting slept on. Because, again, players still are successful at every round at each position. It's just how frequent. That's all we're talking about, is frequency. I do think that this kind of on a broad scale can make you say, okay, well, if I'm not sure which player I like better in the 4th round, we need a center and we need a linebacker, and there's 2 guys who I like them kind of equally as prospects, maybe take the linebacker in the 4th round, because that's the guy who that position tends to translate well to the NFL in 4th rounds, whereas centers, not so much. Again, I know there's exceptions. I'm not saying there isn't. That's kind of the way that I view this stuff, but I do find it interesting. And again, one of the biggest takeaways we have from this is there just isn't that much difference total with a lot of these positions outside of a few. But again, interesting to know that the elite guys tend to be drafted in the 1st round, which we knew, but it's rare for it to be 2nd or 3rd round. And then also kind of 3rd round is the cutoff for when you typically get solid players. So that's kind of what we've learned, I think. But that's what I think. What do you guys think about all of this interesting stuff? Let me know in the comments below. Always love hearing from you. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.